I'd just like to welcome and thank you everyone that was able to join us this morning. And just to give a brief introduction to the AAC Spotlight and the reason why we've put together these virtual events to allow our partners and our network to remain engaged during these difficult times. I mean, when we look at the current spend around mitigation for the COVID-19 across the globe, we're looking at about $4.6 trillion that's been invested by various governments, bilateral donors, multinational institutions, philanthropic donors, NGOs, private sector as well, to try to manage this this pandemic. And further commitments I know have been made to keep the supply of food uninterrupted. And I know Atuka will touch a little bit on that from the African Development Bank, of course, but a lot more will need to be spent. And it is during these difficult times that the role of the AAC is ever more crucial, because we need to continue promoting the African continent as an agri-food business and investment destination. And we need to keep looking at the best ways to connect our network to capture and proactively engineer networks that will allow for market access. And these are just some of the few issues that we're facing currently as an industry and as the entire world, with the ongoing lockdowns, travel restrictions, logistical bottlenecks, and we just need to relook at agriculture and prioritize the development of sustainable local productions. We need to look at robust supply chains. We need to look how we can drive technology adoption right now, because if we can do all these things during this difficult time, I do believe that by the time the pandemic is over, the industry and the continent itself will be able to emerge stronger than it was before going into the pandemic. So I'm hoping that the panel that we've put together and the partners that are able to join us during this discussion will be able to contribute to how to attain that level and how to continue with the supply of food production across the continent and across the world. So that is just a brief introduction in terms of why we're doing these AAC Spotlight events. And just for some of our participants across the globe, I would like to give you some operational guidelines for you to be able to navigate the platform that we're using and to have a great experience. As you can see on your left-hand side, you have the three options. You have receptions, and that was the landing page, sessions where you currently are, and you have the networking button. So after this introduction from our Wendy, as well as the plenary speakers, you will be able to join 3 other parallel sessions. Wendy will give you the introduction in terms of what should be expected from the other 3 parallel sessions. And after that, you will be able to move into the networking function. So the networking functionality works quite simple. So all you have to do, you have to click on the networking, and it will randomly pair you with somebody else who is attending the event. So you will be able to network and engage as if you're having a Zoom video call with the other participants across the globe. And once you are done with the conversation, we've put the networking to 3 minutes. We've limited the networking to 3 minutes. After you've managed to discuss and engage with the other participants, their information will be sent directly into your Hopin account. So you don't have to hurry up to take their contact details. Everything will be sent to you automatically into your account. And on your right-hand side, you will see the chat functionalities, and the chat functionalities will allow you to comment on the overall event. You will be able to comment on specific sessions. You just have to look at the 2 different buttons, and you will be able to chat directly with the other participants as you see fit. So welcome once again on our AAC Spotlight. And that being said, I would like to introduce our chair for today, Wendy Green. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Ben, and hi everyone. I can see the numbers climbing and people that are joining, so it's really wonderful to have you all on today. And just like to say congratulations to the African Agri Council for setting this up. I think it's the first kind of virtual conference I've ever attended, and certainly, so it's a new experience for all of us. So thank you so much. It's great to see you being so innovative. So I am a farmer and advise across mainly the energy and agricultural sectors. So I am on the farm at the moment in lockdown. So if you hear chickens and cattle and dogs and horses in the background, you'll have to just forgive us on this side. I think we're all experiencing those wonderful challenges. I think just to kick off, I think, Ben, you've given a really good introduction, but certainly the outbreak of this pandemic is a prime example of in the past what we've called the black swan phenomenon, entirely unexpected and completely unpredictable. And obviously, to make things more complicated, the outcome in terms of its impacts and implications is certainly very uncertain. What we do know is that the disease is spreading quickly and affecting significant elements of both food supply and demand. And we are risking a looming food crisis unless we take measures to, to keep the food supply chain alive and mitigate the impacts across the food system. So if we just kind of look at what our current situation is and what is happening in some of the different countries, I'm sure that you've all read a lot. I think we've got lockdowns now in at least 33 of Africa's 54 countries. And in some cases, farmers are being blocked from getting food to markets and obviously, threatening delivery of food. I think I read an article last week I think it was Zimbabwe, where farmers were stopped trying to get food to a market, and 2 to 3 tons of fresh fruit and vegetables were actually burned by the police. So there's this struggle in kind of trying to keep lockdown regulations at the same time as keeping people safe. So according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, about 1 in every 5 people in Africa, nearly 250 million, already didn't have enough food before the outbreak. So this is obviously a real concern. The World Food Programme was already feeding millions in Africa, and mainly rural people, due to many different disasters, natural disasters, government failures, plagues of locusts that we've seen. So obviously this pandemic now is adding another layer of hardship to our continent. So that's just kind of a couple of, a little bit around the situation where we're at. So in thinking about this and preparing for this conference today, I really came up with 7 major points, which I think will be at the top of everybody's minds and which I'm sure will be covered by our panelists today. And firstly, pricing and markets. So, can we expect further drops across the sector? We're already seeing it in South Africa in the red meat industry. Which markets are going to stay, which are going to collapse? Hopefully we'll see some new innovative markets, establishing through this time. The second point is around supply chains and logistics across, and I mean that across all levels, local, provincial, national, as well as imports and exports. Thirdly, and very importantly, is social impact. So I've touched on these previously, how the pandemic is impacting people across the continent, but certainly down to a local level, the health of farmers, the health of the farm workers, if they're not there to produce, what is going to happen? Increased malnourishment, hunger, and starvation across the continent. The fourth area that I think we'll cover today is the impact of the virus on agricultural investment. And I mean this both at a local level as well as a national and international level. Are farmers going to have resources to be able to plant next year's crop? And that's where we can really start to, either worry or support farmers in doing that. As well as on a broader scale, is agricultural investment into the continent going to slow down or pause during this time? I think another important question which some of our panelists will cover is what support and or recovery measures can the food and agricultural sector expect from bilateral partners and financial institutions? And we have some of those parties in the sessions today. 6 points is, of course, as always, there are risks and there are opportunities. So what are the opportunities that could come out of this? And finally, what are we going to learn from this? You know, how can we as an agricultural community be more proactive, reactive, and innovative to minimize the negative impacts? And how are we going to make sure that we emerge from this crisis with a more sustainable, resilient food system across the continent and across and around the globe? So that for me maybe covers the 7 points which have been in the top of my mind in preparing for this session. And I think we'll cover them through the different panels. So once again, you know, welcome to everybody. And as we've said, you know, please do post your questions on the right side, and we will try and get our panelists to answer your questions. So we're going to jump straight into the first, into the plenary session entitled Resilience Under Uncertainty, the Agri-Food Crisis Management. And today we have two experienced panelists, Atsuka Toda and Vaughan McTaggart. Atsuka is the Director of Agricultural Finance and Rural Development for the African Development Bank, and Vaughan is the Managing Director, Agricultural Development of AFGRI. So Atsuka and Vaughan, I'm just going to ask you each to start with the kind of 5 minutes statement around the topic, and then we'll go into a question and answer session, and I'll incorporate some of the questions from our delegates which are posted on the right-hand side. So maybe Atsuka, would you like to start?
Thank you so much, Wendy, and that was an excellent framing of the questions. I really like the 7 points that you mentioned. And let me also take the opportunity to thank the African Agri Council for this very innovative event. Just when we look at agriculture in 2020, it is going to be a very difficult year. It would be nice to organize some of the big impacts into buckets. Like Wendy said, there are existing challenges to the food system, which includes the locust disease in the Horn of Africa, the fall armyworm, climate change, armed conflict, refugee crisis. There's a couple of buckets. There's a couple of elements of a food system which is challenged in general in Africa. Add to that another bucket, which is importation. Africa as a total imports more than $47 billion worth of food. Add to that currency devaluation. A number of African currencies have devalued against the US dollar. And add to that the measures which are happening because of trying to contain COVID, which include the lockdowns, the movement restrictions that you mentioned. So you have those 4 quadrants and these different levels of challenges. And what we're seeing is that there could be a first order of impact, which is really around access to food and food availability, which links to a second order of impacts, which actually impinges on food security. And then thirdly, we have the larger food system discussion that's going on. So what are we seeing? Let me break it up into 3 areas. We're seeing massive shifts in demand. So as Wendy mentioned, the question is going to be, what is going to happen to food prices? So in demands, what we're seeing is that because of the lockdowns and the closures of markets in countries like US, Europe, Asia, the export market is shrinking. So countries in Africa that are exporting commodities, their markets are shrinking. A second phenomenon that we're starting to see in the markets is that governments are looking at stockpiling. And that could be a big problem, particularly in the grains. We see wheat stockpiling starting to happen, as well as a danger of rice. Thirdly, in internal and local markets, there's a panic buying which has started because of these closures. And so you see, for example, in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, where panic buying is happening, and that's increasing the price of food as high as to 30%. And then finally, what exacerbates the challenge, which Wendy alluded to, is that low-income households cannot even panic buy. They cannot actually stock more because they don't have the income to do so. So they have to drop food consumption. So in general, there are 4 major trends in terms of the demands, and those need to be looked at in terms of different segments and different commodities. In terms of discretionary spending in general, that is likely to fall, but even with non-discretionary spending, when it comes to low-income households, there is no capacity. So what else are we seeing? Secondly, we're seeing there are a number of logistic constraints and supply chain disruptions which are happening because of these trade restrictions that are happening. And we do have a map of where trade restrictions are happening, and movement restrictions, which actually have both input and output effects. Not only can agri inputs not get to farmers, but then also there are road blockages for producers to get to market. So there's the whole issue of logistical constraints and the breakdown. And add to that the relatively small buffer, which means that there is not enough stock in storage to be able, because supply chains have been made so efficient, to be able to buffer those shocks. And then thirdly, the issue of lack of liquidity. And this has also an impact on the larger agribusiness players, where they are needing immediate short-term liquidity, which usually means working capital because of a loss of revenue. But imagine if the loss of liquidity is an issue for the big supply chain players, for the smaller MSMEs, the micro, small, medium enterprises, which offer a lot of employment in the rural areas, actually that liquidity problem becomes immediately an insolvency problem. So it is not just about liquidity, but insolvency for a huge segment of employment that is created in the rural space. So quickly moving on to then what do we need to do? I think what's very important as we look forward is that all players, whether they be public or private, look at immediate response and then short to medium term responses. So immediately, I think this is what the effort of governments is. It's not just a health crisis, but on the heels of it, it can become a food crisis. Governments, and we need to lobby as private sector, as players working with public sector, to make sure that food channels remain open, to make sure that value chain players in agricultural supply chains are named essential, to ensure that trade is not put out there and unnecessary, like uninformed decisions don't take place with regards to export, import, around trade. And then of course the food reserves and the release of food from those food reserves. I think that's extremely important. And just with regards to the short but more medium term, but what's very important for companies is that I think companies are really looking at how to secure supplies. And that's looking at shorter value chains. And I think, going forward, I think shorter and more local sourcing will be extremely important. Our loans to SMEs, as we mentioned, that's getting the financial sector to really step up to give loans to SMEs and guaranteeing those. E-commerce has seen a great opportunity, and we need to take advantage of that in Africa. And then finally, I think just building up the stocks and storage, I think that will be extremely important, which is, something where we have to define between efficiency and resilience, because I think a lot of companies do actually look at storage as an extra cost, but this shock has shown that it's not just an extra cost, but it is a factor for resilience. So I think that's in terms of immediate and short-term measures. We really have yet to see what impact this will have on the food system, and that's a conversation for all of the players. And we're just hoping that we can come out of COVID and post-COVID, that there will be much more resilience in the system, and that could be the greater effects going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Atsuko. I think those are really, really great great points that you covered, and kind of really practical, and I think what is happening on the ground. You know, certainly some of the, you know, how the consumers are reacting with the stockpiling, as you say, you know, only those people with money in their bank account can go and buy 3 months of groceries, you know, or even a month's worth of groceries to get through the month. So that is really a big point. As well as, you know, interesting how we've spent so many years working on getting this efficient, you know, value chain of food, and yet now, you know, it's not a good thing. Actually, we needed more stock along the way of our value chain, which is a really interesting point. So thanks so much. I think Vaughan, over to you. You are on mute. If you want to just okay, there. I think you're all.
There seemed to be an echo somehow from the microphone, so I'm sorry. I just muted it. I hope that's better. Firstly, thank you so much to Agri Council, to Atsuka, to Wendy. Thank you for hosting this. I think it's a fantastic event, and yeah, something we need to get used to. But I think it is something for the future. I think I can only echo what Atsuko said. I mean, these are problems that we are facing across the entire continent at the moment. If you look at the continent of Africa, and even outside of Africa, you know, these are the problems that we are going to be facing. And what I'd like to concentrate on more today is the sort of rather short, medium, and longer term solutions that we can start looking at, because I totally agree with her in terms of, you know, Africa in particular is going to have to start looking at local sourcing and upgrading and re-looking at their food systems, specifically storage. So, you know, those are things that I think hopefully something like this has brought to the forefront of African governments to start seriously looking at local sourcing, local supply, development of local supply, and then obviously the value chains surrounding that, and then the storage surrounding that. What we've been busy with literally for the last 7 years within the agri-development space within AFGRI is we've been looking at how do we support that as a large agricultural company. How do we support the development specifically of grassroots production? How do we start creating production? Because you cannot have a supply chain if there's no production. You cannot have processing if there's no production. And I know a lot of companies have gone into Africa with the industrial hat on saying, let us start looking at industrialization. But industrialization is not going to happen if there's a lack of production. And unfortunately, you cannot sustain industrialization with imports. I mean, it's just not possible. I mean, we're seeing that now. Most factories, etc., are closed down across Africa because they rely on raw product imports. So what we've been looking at is saying, what does it look like for agri-services companies? What does it look like for agri-players to get together and start finding solutions together for the actual generation of production? And how do we start making farmers in Africa productive? And literally the last 7 years of what I've been doing is looking at ways of doing that. And we've been on the ground now in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and we've made many mistakes. And we really have, we've got a t-shirt, and it is a horse we ride called experience, because we've really tried various methods, from going in there and having what the Germans call a spoke and a spoke model, where you have a center of equipment and expertise that assist farmers, to a number of other value chain and added services that we've tried to provide to farmers, and none have really worked effectively for a number of reasons. And I mean, we could talk about that for hours. But I think where we have come is we started a thing called ABBA initiatives. Now, ABBA means father, a father initiative, where we've realized that if we put in a commercially operative farm and then start training people from that, and then start taking those people that we've trained and making them commercially sustainable, but with a farm that is there for the long term. So it's not a 6-month program, it's not a 1-year program, it's a 10, 15-year program. And I think how this relates to the COVID is I think we've been preparing for something we didn't realize was going to happen. And with this happening, we realized that it is of absolute essential importance that we start now including other players, players like the African Development Bank, players like AfriExim, World Bank, and saying, guys, we need to find solutions of being able to offer finance. We're talking about liquidity issues here. Finance through these ABBA initiative farms to local farmers to get them commercially sustainable in order to create a commercially sustainable supply chain in the African countries where they can locally source product. And literally what we've developed is what we call an ABBA model. And I'm not trying to sell anything here. I'm just trying to say that I think we have a blueprint that we can start looking at seriously involving the agri players around us, industry players, from suppliers, from donor environment, into a thing where we really start looking at saying, okay, this has happened, and it's not the first time it's happened in the world, and it's not the last time it's going to happen in the world. But it has woken us up to the fact that we're going to have to start looking at other solutions. We're going to have to start looking at longer term crops. We're going to have to start looking at value crops. We're going to have to start looking at balancing our export crops with our import crops. With our local crops. You know, it is all great and well us lending a dollar funding to go into Africa. I mean, if we look at the currencies, I look at the South African currency. I mean, it's dropped 30% in the last couple of weeks. If I had a dollar commitment out there, I'm in serious trouble. You know, and this is the type of thing that we've been looking at. So, you know, from our point of view, we really need to start concentrating on getting our farmers. Now, we've got hundreds of thousands, millions of farmers across the continent, but how do we start getting them productive? And how do we start looking at the mix of crops? I think in the past, we've been looking at your sort of cash crops, your maize, your vegetables, that type of thing. And we've been starting to realize if we do not start attaching that to longer term, more sustainable biological assets, and we do not start really concentrating on the development of the production sector, things like this, we're not going to be able to survive in the future. And as Tsuka said earlier, we don't even know yet what the full impact of this is going to be on food security, on the value chains, on people's ability to purchase food. We might have a lot of food, but how do we get people to purchase it? So the question is a lot larger question than just production or food. It is creating sustainable income for people. It is creating almost, I want to say, a self-sustainability to a certain extent within the African continent. Even if we start with a village, I mean, you know, we're talking countries here, but I mean, even if we start with just getting villages, towns, things to start becoming self-sustainable, to have a good mixture of export and import, we'll start attracting the funding that we require, the longer term funding that we require to set up farmers. So from my perspective, I'm not talking about the whole of AFGRI, because obviously we have a financial sector within there. We've got a bank that is looking at various ways of how we can combat this. We've got a storage, we've got a section that does just storage and food storage. You know, I'm talking just from a development perspective. I think this thing has really started waking us up to the fact that, you know, these things that we've been concerned about is an absolute reality. and we need to start doing something about it. And what we've realized is if we do not start working as a cohesive force in terms of all the role players in the agri sector, we're not going to make a difference. We need to get private sector, we need to get governments, we need to get people involved in something that is practical, something that is sustainable, and something that is more long-term. And we've got to start thinking a little bit out of the box. We've got to start seeing how we attach these things to processing. I know in the past, a lot of governments have been looking at these massive agri-parks that they put in place before there's any production. They've proved to not work in the past. And we need to start taking those examples and start understanding them to create some form of stability in the actual production sector. So for us, that is what we're looking at. Those are the things that we've been concentrating on, we've been working on, and I think we're now at a stage where we've gone through all the development, and we're at a stage to start sharing now and start saying, okay, how do we start making a difference? So when this hits again, or if it happens again, or whatever the crisis is again, how do we ensure that at least there is some form of self-sustainability amongst the poorest of the poor who are starting to actually get we are starting to break the back of that. So those are the things we're thinking around and trying to develop. But you know, I understand that it's not maybe directly related to this, but this is something that has woken us up to the fact that you know, we need to start concentrating on getting people more and more productive in various crops, not just our maize and our wheat, because we've drowned Africa with that, and it hasn't worked. We need to start looking at more sustainable, longer-term crops in amongst the mix, and there's different ways we need to start looking at that.
Great, Vaughan, thanks very much. I think practical also solutions there, and really interesting work that you're doing with AFRI, and commend you for that. It really sounds great, and I look forward to seeing some of that research and seeing it, you know, share it into the industry and how we can actually bring the industry together to find some of those solutions. Obviously, when you talk about production, the biggest thing is always the marketing and, you know, getting those products to a market. So if you kind of had a magic wand, how would you see that support happening for both subsistence and commercial farmers, you know, who are rural? You know, if there were no limitations, kind of what would your solution, you know, look like? How would you see it?
I think if I could take a practical example of what we've seen with the projects that we've had on the ground, you know, we've been looking at how do we develop our production cycle in line with market. So we haven't gone in and said, this is a great farm, we can do this, this, and this. We've gone the other way around and we've reversed it. We've gone to market and we've gone to understand the market in that region and understand the requirements of processing, etc. I think processing is going to play a major role because we've been able to prove that to be able to step up production is actually the easy part. To be able to get people to provide a quality product it's obviously got its challenges, but that's the easy part. What do we do next? And I think what we've really got to do is we've got to look at commodities that have still got a higher value that don't require processing. I'm talking nuts, I'm talking citrus, I'm talking avocados. There's massive demands across the globe for things like that. We have some of the best climates and soils in Africa for those type of products. Things like black spot that has made it impossible for us to do citrus in places like Zambia is now we've got developed cultivars that we can do that. So for me, it is that fine mix of saying, okay, you know, there is a smaller demand for horticulture, so let us allow the locals to do horticulture and let's just train them in horticulture. But at the same time, for us to have a sustainable base, let's start looking at the higher value commodities where we can create the path to market. And let's start linking with the larger commercial farmers. In South Africa, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to go to the larger commercial farmers and saying, because we're in this area and there's a lot of commercial land available, or sorry, a lot of government or communal land available in this area, if we can get funding to get farmers productive, and we use the existing infrastructure and the existing routes to markets that you have, and I tell you, the farmers are very excited about it. You know, so I hope that's answering your question, because the question is very broad. I mean, we could go into, but I'm saying in practically, it is just different ways of starting to look in and reverse engineering it to ensure that the farm that we are setting up that is commercially sustainable is not competing against the people that we are trying to make productive, but creating a route to market for those people, creating the voice for them to be able to say, you know what, we've actually got enough product now to put up a processing plant. So it's just doing it the other way around that we used to do it. You know, instead of putting up a tomato paste plant and getting people to start growing tomatoes, let's get people to start growing product. And when we've got enough product, we can start putting up the processing facilities. And then let's link that into international market. But let's get the guys to be able to compete first on a raw product basis before we try and get them to deliver into something that they can't compete at. So it's reverse engineering, reverse looking at it, and actually attaching our agri programs to the market rather than trying to get the market to attach to our agri programs.
Yeah, I really like your approach, and I think, as I said, it always starts with the market, and it's also about being practical. You know, it doesn't make sense to go and grow, for example, tomatoes somewhere really remote where actually nuts or non-perishable, you know, foods is a much better option that people can actually get it to market. And also, you know, crops which don't require a lot of machinery, you know, in their management. For example, nut trees, you know, it takes some equipment to plant, but, you know, someone on the ground can actually manage an orchard quite easily, you know, through once it's actually planted. So I think that's a really good approach and really practical. I'm going to, because we've kind of got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go through some of the questions on the right-hand side. And I think the first question is probably for you, Atsuko. There's a question from Jonas. How can the infrastructure in African countries support the short and medium-term actions that you suggested? That's a question from Jonas Ogbai.
Thank you so much. I was actually listening to just scrolling through the chat, and I saw a number of infrastructure-related questions, which I think are extremely important. And definitely there is a lack of infrastructure on the African continent in general. So there is a massive need for investment in that space. But there are specific pieces which pertain to food safety and quality. I think there's the food safety infrastructure. There's also the whole infrastructure and what governments need to do to promote that, as well as where private sector should have a level playing field going into that. And then, of course, we need to see what will. Of course, the hard infrastructure is actually very important as well. So I think, you know, in the medium term, as Vaughn was saying, there's going to be a need to see what we can do on shorter value chains, which will create much more resilience to increase that production. I mean, I actually have a question. We have been working with the private sector, and Vaughn mentioned you know, there's a need for private sector to collaborate. I'd be really interested in what that collaboration looks like and what the non-competitive space is to actually come out with the new food system, in the sense that the larger players, all said and done, will be able to consolidate and bounce back. You have a lot of smaller players that do not have that bounce back capacity. So I'm just wondering, you know, what will that mean, and how will that restructure the landscape? Yeah, and so I think from the African Development Bank side, we do have a crisis response, which is about liquidity to governments, basically. And, you know, mostly for health purposes, but we're trying to ensure that food security purposes are also entailed. But on the back of that, we really need to see what we can do better with the private sector. And that's why I think this forum is so important.
Maybe, Vaughan, how do you see that engagement between private sector governments and, you know, and institutions like the African Development Bank? You know, in what forum do we do that, and how do we make sure that we, you know, we're thinking through everything, we have all the advice, and we're really putting into place actionable solutions, quick actionable solutions, you know, that we can actually make sure that production is, you know, farmers are planting for next season, because we don't want, you know, this to just get worse and worse and worse, you know, going into winter here now. How do you see that, and how can we speed it up?
Yeah, I really think that these are the forums that bring these things to the front. And I think I will definitely, after this, within the next week or so, if Atsuka's got the time, I'll spend some time with her discussing it and seeing how do we bring other players to the forefront, and maybe doing something like this with those players, and then being able to go back to the people that have been involved in this thing and say, you know what, we've discussed it, this is what we're going to be instituting, this is what we're looking at, so that we've got some form of going forward, because there are solutions, there are ways that we can start getting private sector. And I'm talking about, for instance, AFRI's got access to a whole lot of farmers. How do we start mobilizing those farmers to start assisting the smaller guys into their value chains, rather than the smaller guys just closing down and the bigger guys just eating them up? Because that's just unfortunately how it happens and how it works. You know, but in order to do that, we need liquidity. In order to do that, we need finance, and we need to start looking at ways that the commercial players and the agri businesses would be able to offer some form of comfort to the likes of the banks, and to say, okay, you know, here are programs we're putting in place that's going to assume a bit of the risk that you as a bank cannot take. And how we can work together to ensure that the banks then feel comfortable to lend longer-term, medium to longer-term funding to farmers that they don't know and that don't have a track record, because that is unfortunately the landscape of Africa. So this is definitely a discussion that I think we should take forward, and I will definitely be contacting Atsuka to do that. And I'm sure there'd be no problem in us giving feedback to the Agri Council, that will be able to give feedback to the guys that have been part of this discussion.
That'll be really great. And I think it probably follows into a question that I see from Stephen Awua, who's asking about the local sourcing and development of solid supply chains at the local levels, you know, in the countries and between countries. So it's not only about, you know, South Africa making sure that we're doing it for ourselves, but that we're, you know, it's also about finding those places where the crops or the products are grown best. You know, how do we get that inter-country, you know, Africa solutions for Africans going in terms of resilience, you know?
Maybe if I can very quickly and then hand over to you know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that was the whole spirit behind that. When Tanzania or Uganda has grains, Kenya can buy, and this is the whole idea around regional integration. So this actually provides further impetus to ensure that these supply chains that right now are much more about importing globally can happen a little bit more regionally, maybe. Thank you.
I'd just like to add something to that. I think we forget the absolute blessed position Africa's in terms of its climates, in terms of its soils, in terms of the various climates on this continent. If the country started working better, and let's just look at export crops as an example, because I think that is something we should seriously be starting to look at. Is starting to take advantage of the various climates. Export crops, let's just talk nuts as an example. It's a fairly easy thing to export. You don't have to add value immediately. You have the ability to store it for a while. It's a little bit more robust. It will be able to handle some of the roads in Africa. You know, if we looked at something like that, and we looked at 3 or 4 or 5 countries with varying climates, we could literally become the only continent in the world that is offering a product all year round to an international market. But that's going to take countries playing together in, you know, we need to coordinate that together. And the whole idea from our side is how do we get the smaller scale farmers involved in commercial sustainable production? If we can get that right, I mean, let's just take pecans as an example. We could possibly, as an African continent, start providing into the pecan value chain 12 months a year. Not everybody has that ability, so we need to start taking the advantage of the agricultural resources and stuff we have in Africa. But we're only going to do that as a collective. I think we've been doing a lot alone, but I think we need to start becoming more of a collective to see how this looks and how it can play out, and really start sweating the agricultural assets. And I think the greatest asset we have is the people. I mean, the people of Africa is the greatest asset that we have. How do we start taking that asset and the God-given asset that we have, putting that together and really playing a major role in the international market? And I think we can, but it's going to take a coordinated effort.
No, I agree completely, and absolutely, our greatest asset is, you know, the people producing. And as I said in my 7 points, you know, one of the things that we really need to consider is the social side, and you know, keeping our farmers, our producers healthy, safe, and you know, keeping producing and making sure that they can actually get the, you know, the products to the markets and through the value chain to the consumer. So I see there's a lot of wonderful questions on the right-hand side. I'm really sorry that we can't cover them all, but maybe we can, you know, cover them in the feedback, Ben. I think, you know, some of them maybe we can answer, but I think they're valuable, even just, you know, to get us thinking in certain different directions. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much to Atsuko and Vaughan for your great insights. I think I really look forward to seeing some you know, something tangible coming out of this, and you know, the leaders in the industry have to drive this and make sure that we are more resilient in this uncertain time. So thank you so much. I think you're on mute, Ben.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Vaughan, for all your insights. As Wendy said, there's quite a lot of questions that people have been posting, and what we will do is we will make sure that some of those questions are answered. But however, we have another set. We have 3 parallel sessions now, and people can still ask those questions, and Vaughan and Atsuko can still respond directly to some of those questions in the chat comments. So I'd just like to invite everyone to click on the session button to be able to access the 3 parallel sessions that are available. And if you would like to network, you can go into the networking function. And when you are paired with somebody, please do click on the connect button so that you can exchange details. Thank you very much, and see you in the next session. Wendy, see you in the next session. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.